I welcome all of you to this interesting panel discussion on burden of proof and shifting thereof and recent developments in the law vis-a-vis direct tax and vis-a-vis indirect tax. Direct tax issues will be handled by Mr. Saurabh Soparkar, and indirect tax issues will be dealt with by Mr. Sridharan. And we are going to have a moderator as Pradeep Bhai Kapasi. Just before I hand over it to Pradeep Bhai Kapasi, I will have one brief thought on this, about this overall panel discussion which is there. I can compare it with something like we are going to have a Jugalbandi, and wherein two speakers, the two people are going to participate in that, one on direct tax, one on indirect tax. It is going to be a Jugalbandi between two laws. And we are going to have our Jugalbandi conductor as Pradeep Bhai. And as I understand in the concept of Jugalbandi, as I understand, that there is no competition in Jugalbandi. That those people are not going to compete. They are going to ensure that the overall panel discussion as a whole, the overall performance which happens, that reaches to the next level. That is what they are going to ensure. With these brief remarks, I will hand over the proceedings to Pradeep Bhai. So please carry on and enjoy this interesting, excellent panel discussion which we are going to have. Thank you very much.
Good evening, friends.
Sir, one small. No interrupt.
No, always a bigger
Not
one.
at all, nothing.
Yes, yeah, please.
We are told there's Jugalbandi between an income tax expert, undoubtedly, and somebody.
Sure.
So once a beautiful lady proposed to Bernard Shaw that we'll marry, so that our child will be brilliant as also beautiful. Then Bernard Shaw said, if the child takes up your intelligence and my beauty, there will be disaster. Okay. So we will not, I will not open my mouth on income tax.
So my learned friend happens to be a doyen of indirect tax bar, so obviously we'll have a lot to learn from him, including I'll have a lot to learn.
We'll learn from each other.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Thank you.
No. This is a wonderful start. I don't think, we could ask for any better start. The things are, so very well lightened. Yeah, we are going to talk about burden of proof, yes. And as Suhas said, it is some kind of a Jugalbandi. The only thing is that, that the difference is that, it will reach the crescendo when they complement each other, and that is what is desired today. I have been practicing for a number of years. It's very rarely that, that one would feel honored about, being a part of some conference or a discussion. And today is one such day, wherein I feel deeply honored with the presence of, two very eminent senior advocates, doyens of profession, and otherwise in a way, friends. So one is really happy. We are all going to be, the subject is identified. If I were to, relate this subject to something nearest to what has happened recently, the one thing which I could found, one thing which I could connect was the recent state assembly elections in Maharashtra. You would notice that, yes, that, there were two parties who got together and contested the election on a joint platform, got the required majority also, and then thereafter, both of them were put to some kind of a burden of proof, wherein the one party claimed, that yes, there was a promise given by the other party to share the chief ministership. And there was no way whereunder it could be proved that, whether that promise was really there or not. And with that, I felt that, there is an element of correlation to what we are going to discuss. And as if this was not ending there, it further proceeded whereunder, the government was put under a burden of proof to decide which party has a majority. And each of the parties, including the other parties which did not have majority, felt under the burden to form the government because they felt that, they had a mandate from the people to form the government or facilitate formation of government. As if that was not so, the governor, was put under a serious burden, whereunder should he entertain Ajit Pawar's letter as a proof of majority or not. He felt that there was a sufficient burden discharged, but when it went to Supreme Court felt that perhaps that was not so. So this is the story is all about what we are going to discuss about. All of us have been practicing for donkey's years, and we all believe that we know how to discharge the burden. And every third case tells you that what first case had told was not perhaps correct. And therefore, I for once, I have always been in dilemma that whether I have advised my client correctly in discharging the burden or not. With this confusion around, the first question is for Mr. Soparkar's consideration is that, sir, please explain in brief the doctrine of the burden of proof as is understood generally.
In as much as this question is likely to occur in all subsequent questions, I'll take some time in dealing with this issue in little greater detail so that I may not have to repeat this issue again and again when I come to specifics. But before I really get into the answer, I must compliment the organizers of the seminar for organizing seminar on this small, tricky and interesting issue. Normally we do not find one full seminar devoted to this interesting issue, and the questions open up large number of interesting controversies. To the extent I can deal with them, I would certainly answer these issues. With this preliminary remark, let me get into the question of burden of proof and how do we really examine the issue. Now, if you look at the question of burden of proof in law, we find under the Indian Evidence Act, there is a whole chapter devoted to the question of burden of proof. Before we really go into the sections dealing with burden of proof, I must make one statement of reservation. Section 1 of the Indian Evidence Act says it will apply to all proceedings which are taken in a court. Tax proceedings are not proceedings in a court, to which I'll come to later. And therefore, ipso facto, if one has to apply the provisions of the Indian Evidence Act, they may not be applicable. However, the principles enumerated under the Indian Evidence Act are the principles which are broadly on the basis of common sense. The Supreme Court therefore applies principles of the Indian Evidence Act, not because the Evidence Act is applicable ipso facto to the income tax proceedings, but because they are principles of common sense. For example, in the famous case of Chuharmal, 172 ITR 250, an SSE was found to be in possession of 565 foreign branded watches which he had hidden in an almari, which was a secreted compartment. When a question arose as to whether he is able to explain the source of such investment, he said, "Prove that I am the owner of these assets." The court took the view that if you are in possession of an asset, the law presumes you are the owner. That's the law as prescribed under Section 110 of the Evidence Act. But the Supreme Court qualified that the Evidence Act, though it does not per se apply, there is no reason to assume that the common principle of the Evidence Act should not be made applicable. In other words, you do not look at the Evidence Act to find out which section is to be applied to the Income Tax Act. You look at the Evidence Act for the purpose of drawing support, for the purpose of raising arguments in your favor or to deal with arguments against you on the first principle as the principles which would explain the normal situation. Now with this, let's see which are the sections of the Evidence Act on the question of burden of proof which may have relevance under the Income Tax Act. Section 101 of the Evidence Act says 101 to 110 are the relevant sections. We are likely to be concerned with 5. 101 says, whoever desires any court to give judgment as the basis of a legal right or liability dependent on existence of the fact, it's for him to prove that fact. If he cannot prove the fact, he will not get the judgment. In other words, burden to prove a fact on which you want to rely is on you, and the next section makes it very clear. Burden of proof lies on a person who would fail in absence of evidence of either party. Therefore, if neither party has laid evidence, who is likely to succeed? The other party has the burden of proving the fact to his benefit. If he is not leading any evidence, he will lose because the law assumes that it is for him to prove that. Take a simple example. SS is claiming deduction under section 80IB, saying that he is a small-scale industrial manufacturer. That it is for him to show he is an SSI manufacturer. If SS is claiming deduction in relation to exports, it's for him to show that he has exported the goods and goods are not sold in the domestic market. You cannot expect revenue to prove that he has sold the goods in the domestic market to begin with. It's for the SSI to show that goods were sold in a foreign market. Section 103 says that burden of proof as to a particular fact would ordinarily lie on the person who has privy to that particular fact. Section 106 says when a fact is especially within the knowledge of a person, burden of proving that fact is on him. If SSE claims that this is a partnership firm, it is a fact known to him, it's for him to bring in the partnership deed. It's for him to point out that in fact there is a partnership business. You cannot expect revenue to prove that there is in fact no partnership. Therefore, if it is something which is to the knowledge of the SSE, it's for the SSE to prove. And the last section, which is likely to have some bearing on the tax proceeding, is section 110, which in fact is lifted under the Income Tax Act also as section 292C, where a person is found to be in possession of anything, burden of proving that he is not the owner of that thing lies on him. Law assumes possession goes hand in hand with the ownership. So if you are in possession, law assumes you are the owner. It may as well be that you may not be owner, but then it will be for you to prove that you are not the owner by leading evidence as to title documents or otherwise. But otherwise, if you are found to be in possession at the time of search, if a person is found to be in possession of gold ornaments of 1 kilogram, law will assume he is the owner. And if law assumes he is the owner, and if he claims, no, they did not belong to me, they belong to my boss who had left it to me with me for safe custody, or they belong to my sister-in-law who is living abroad, it's for him to lead evidence to show this. These are broadly the principles of the Evidence Act which are made applicable to the income tax proceedings. Couple of more things over here. We always have a concept of burden of proof and onus of proof. Now, what is the distinction? The distinction is from the perspective of, as we call, there are two different kinds of burden: legal burden and evidentiary burden. Legal burden is a burden which is always on a person which law expects him to prove. Whereas evidentiary burden is on a person who would, once the person on whom legal burden vests has discharged his burden. Take a simple example. SSC has received rupees 50 lakh as deposit from X. Burden to prove that there is cash credit is genuine is always on the SSC. But once SSC gives details about the identity, capacity, genuineness of the deposit and the depositor, the burden shifts from the SSC to the revenue to show what SSC is claiming is not correct. Therefore, burden, though it is on SSC, once SSC is discharged what is called primary burden, the onus to disprove that would then rest on the revenue. Let's take it further. Suppose revenue comes across the evidence in the form of statement of the depositor that, sir, I have not given this money. Then owners will again shift back on the SSC to prove that what the depositor is now claiming is incorrect. he is not giving the correct facts because I have failed to repay the deposit and he has animosity with me, or he expected some additional money, or because he is under a pressure, whatever. But then again, onus will shift back on the SSC. Therefore, onus of proof is a shifting onus. It goes shifting from one to another and back to one, depending upon who has laid evidence as to what. But burden of proof, however, remains constant to begin with, which needs to be discharged by the person in order to make other person disprove the fact which he has now proved. Third aspect, if both parties have laid evidences, SSC has laid evidence, revenue has sought to disprove the evidence, again SSC has laid evidence, revenue has sought to disprove, the theoretical concept of burden of proof then disappears. Then the matter will be governed by the theory of preponderance of probability. Both sides having laid evidence, the authority, court, tribunal, whatever, will then weigh as to which is the evidence laid by the respective party for the purpose of finding out where does the truth lie. Therefore, one cannot really depend solely on the theoretical concept of burden of proof by saying burden was on me, I have discharged the burden, or burden was on the other side, it has not discharged the burden. It will ultimately be a factual situation, which party has laid which evidence. Now to this, I said in the beginning, I will come back to this. The tax proceedings are not the proceedings in a court of law. In a court of law, judge has no cause, judge decides the lease between the two parties, judge will listen to the arguments of both sides and then decide who is right, who is wrong. Unlike that, tax proceedings, the tax officer, including CIT appeal, he is not a judge. They are not deciding lease between the parties. In fact, Supreme Court has taken a view in the case of SS Gadgil, 53 ITR 231, that they are administrative authority recovering the taxes. In fact, one can always say that tax proceedings are a little interesting because the assessing officer is acting in his capacity as a party, prosecutor, and a judge. He is the party because he is recovering money for himself. He is the prosecutor because he brings evidence against the SSC, confronts SSC with the evidence, he will try the case. And he is the judge because ultimately it is for him to weigh the evidence, to take a view as to what is required to be accepted and not accepted. But unlike court, there is another important distinction that we must consider. In the court, what is required to be seen is evidence. Income Tax Act nowhere refers to evidence. It refers to the material or information. Section 143(2) says EO will frame assessment on the basis of information. Section 144, best judgment assessment, assessing officer will frame assessment on the basis of material. Material or information as distinguished from the evidence is, former may not be strictly admissible in evidence in a court of law unless it is proved in accordance with law. And therefore, even though something may not be admissible in a court of law, it is always open to assessing officer to refer to and rely upon the same. You cannot say that unless you prove in accordance with law, assessing officer cannot rely upon the same. In the famous case of Dhakeshwari Cotton Mill, 26 ITR 775, Supreme Court says, AO is not bound by the technical rules of evidence, and therefore he can always rely upon the evidence collected by him or gathered by him behind the back of the SSC, may not necessarily on evidence or oath, but the only rule is once he gathers evidence, if he wants to rely upon the evidence against the SSC, he must put SSC to the notice. Therefore, to summarize this discussion, burden of proof is a theory by which we will have to find out which party has to A, begin with prove existence or absence of a fact, and B, once he has discharged that obligation, whether other party is in a position to disprove the existence or absence of a particular fact so as to be able to then take a different view of the matter. The whole discussion, I'm aware, is theoretical in nature, but the subsequent questions are practical on different situations. When we go to the subsequent questions, I deal with fact-wise situation. At this stage, to begin with, I would believe this should be good enough.
Thank you so much. Wonderful beginning, and we'll continue with the same momentum. So, we usually find
Just
Sure, sure.
Saurabh said he's explaining in detail so that rest of the questions can be taken care of. And that applies both to direct as indirect taxes. That's the first thing I wanted to say. There's no difference between the two. Okay.
That's all.
Right. Two, he gave that example of 292C, the 292C,
Yes,
ownership,
yes.
etc.
Yes, yes.
I just want a small narrative and then Parasaran sir used to give a joke. It seems A sold something to B, land. A sold land to B and got the price, etc. 2 days later, purchaser came back and said, I found a treasure, okay. I have not paid for the treasure, so treasure belongs to you. The seller said, no, I have sold the property to you. Whatever is found in it is yours. So the purchaser wanted to return the treasure, seller didn't want to take it. So they went to the minister in the night.
Where was I?
They went to the minister and told this is the position. The minister was so impressed that my citizens are so honest. Next day I will produce them before the king so that everybody can see in Raj Darbar, etc. So next day they came. Now in the morning, the minister briefed the king like this. The next day when they turned up before the king, seller says, sir, he has not paid for the treasure, it belongs to me. Purchaser says, title is vested in me, treasure is found now, it is mine. The minister was aghast. Yesterday night you people said this, today morning you are changing your stand, what is this? Then Parasaran has to say in the midnight, Kali Yuga had come. And everybody has changed their stand.
Okay.
Why I am saying this is this. Normally, the tax department says strict rules of Evidence Act is inapplicable. Broad principle of natural justice are enough. That's what they would have said. In that whatever case, Chatramal or whatever you said, sir, 172 ITR, Chormal. The assessee said, you have found this with me, you are invoking 110, Evidence Act will not apply. Revenue now says, no, Evidence Act, principles of it will apply. So in the first set of cases, Revenue used to say, I need not produce this, I did not follow the strict rules of evidence law. In this case of ownership, the assessee told the department, Mister, you cannot rely on 110 because Evidence Act is inapplicable for income tax. Okay. The revenue said, no, even if 110 doesn't apply, principles can be. So in other words, nothing is permanent in any litigation. Nothing is permanent in tax litigation. And as Saurabh beautifully summarized, nothing is permanent in burden of proof. That is why we say onus of proof is different from burden of proof and is shifting from each other. That's the point I wanted to explain, sir. Thank you.
The only thing which is permanent for me is your wisdom. Yeah, right? So therefore, this answers the question, but we would still like you, Mr. Sridharan, to, elaborate on the second part of it. Is that, is it really that Indian Evidence Act, though Saurabh nicely explained this, that, the principles of Indian Evidence Act are inapplicable at all in deciding an issue under the Income Tax Act, even while it is before the courts? That's one. And the second is we usually, when we present our case, we do, refer to the case laws, the decisions, the precedents, in indirect tax laws or vice versa. In such case, see, our presentation is brushed aside on the ground that, maybe this was delivered under different law and therefore it is not binding on us. So please enlighten us.
So when we cite an income tax judgment before CSTAT, we make sure we cite it from ELT. And I am told, when the DR cites in a customs case, he cites the ITR citation. The ITAT feels safe. You are citing an income tax judgment.
That is it, yes. Very
That's the practical side.
yes.
I didn't anticipate this, but I remember, subject to correction, you can check that, 81 Supreme Court, Sonia Bhatia, on gift. Right? That was not a gift tax case. The question was, what's the meaning of consideration? It's a civil case. The Supreme Court applied the definition of consideration given in the Gift Tax Act. One of the parties argued that that decision is in gift tax, cannot apply to the civil proceedings. The Supreme Court says, ordinarily, artificial definition in one act will not apply for another act. For example, we are an indirect tax lawyer. Food, as defined in food control order, food price order, will not apply for classification under the sales tax schedule or excise schedules. Because there the purpose is to control even the raw material which is going into your food. Right? That's the purpose of that legislation. Similarly, a drug in the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, that definition will not apply for Customs or Excise Act for classification of a medicine. Those are artificial definitions in one act, not to apply for this. But the term consideration is not defined in that particular act. The gift tax definition is not an artificial definition, and therefore it can apply. Therefore, according to us, as Saurabh correctly pointed out, 110 codifies a common law. If some provision of Evidence Act is in derogation of the common law or contrary to the common law, that principle may not strictly apply. But 110, what does it say? If you are found with goods, ordinarily you will be the owner. So, therefore, Supreme Court says 110 is an example of a provision in the Evidence Act which otherwise in conformity with the common principles. Therefore, principle 110 can apply. That's what it says. We have a similar provision in customs in section 123 of the Customs Act, that when goods are found, notified goods are found, that you are illicitly imported is on you. That's the 123 of the Customs Act, similar provisions there. So 110 is one facet of it, 123 is similar to that. There's one point. The other point I wanted to mention, it is not part of the questions you have posed, and I'm giving this answer because that alone is, in burden of proof, my knowledge is zero. Okay. We don't really need in excise and custom that much. Okay. Burden of proof is a procedural law. Amendment to that can apply to pending matters. Your 292C, let's say, assume it came in, say, in 2000, right? A search was conducted in 1995, right? And the matter is in the tribunal after 2000. It is revenue is entirely to rely upon 292C, even though the search was done in 1995. The appeal is being heard by the tribunal in the year 2002. Assessment is 95-96. 292C, since the matter relating to burden of proof, so procedural law will apply to pending matters. There are a series of decisions in customs where zip fasteners was found, then notice was issued much after the search, but between the search and the date of notice, amendment had come, notifying zip fasteners as notified goods, requiring the person in possession to produce evidence of illicit import. Supreme Court says it's a matter is a burden of proof, procedural law, evidence is procedural law, will apply to pending matters. So there's no question of retrospective in it. These are the 2 points I wanted to mention, sir.
They are very wonderfully made, a wonderful addition. We will surely take these up when we talk of the amendment to section 68. And there is a very serious debate that, whether the amendment applies retrospectively or otherwise. The courts are having different views, so we'll surely take up. In the meanwhile, yes, sir. The next one also is for you. What happens is that, on one side, as Saurabh said, that, that the officer himself is a party. Officer himself has a vested interest, and so is the assessee has a vested interest. And none of them are the courts or the judges. Now, in such case, what happens is that I, as an assessee, believe that everything which I claim is allowable. Everything which I claim is allowable, and as an officer, he feels that everything which is claimed is disallowable. Now, in such circumstances, how do we discharge the burden which is cast on us, and whether, as has been explained to us, whether I start with a primary burden and thereafter shift the burden. That's what. Yes.
I don't know whether this is not part of the question you have asked. That's one of the points I raised. But very, very, very important in indirect tax in GST. And I'll explain it in a minute now. Sure. I'm extremely thankful to you for raising that point. It would have slipped out of our mind. Suppose, I believe, I may be wrong, you are the best judge, sir. Income tax department is reasonably matured. It doesn't ask Tata Steel to produce proof of every kg of iron ore purchased. Every car expense incurred, produce proof, it doesn't ask. It doesn't ask for vouchers for each purchase, etc. They go by the audited accounts. If they disbelieved, it's okay. Now, unfortunately, the GST department and service tax department don't have that maturity. 5-6 years ago, I had a case of an assessee where the revenue said burden of proof on input tax credit on the claimant. Perfectly justified. The client had claimed credit for car expense, motor car. The officer asked him, please prove you went to Sridharan's office. You went to Sridharan's office for a discussion of your case, not your personal case. Right? In other words, if for allowing input tax credit, officer asks for each expenditure, produce proof not of paying to the vendor, that it's really this, for this purpose, etc. You can take it from me, all the beautiful words written in GST law about it being a seamless credit, consumption tax, etc. will be made into a zero. And it is not a theoretical exercise. The sales tax authorities in Andhra Pradesh were totally unfamiliar with GST, have now been issuing letters after letters to all assessees to prove that every input tax credit taken by them is legitimate. And they say, section says, burden of proof on the person claiming this is. In income tax, we would have said, the fact that it is recorded in the books of accounts maintained in the usual course, that it is audited, and that report is there saying not personal is enough. Authority can disprove it. It's a case of, as you rightly put, shifting of the burden. I have made a the law requires assessor to prove his claim. He proved it producing audited accounts. The officer doubts it, he can do that. In GST, right, the officers are saying burden is on you. Please prove that the expenditure is for the purpose of business and not credit is disallowed. So this is going to be a nightmare in GST, and Andhra Pradesh authorities have started it. So this answers this burden of proof legal principle, onus of proof, and how if you erroneously apply the concept that burden is on you and mix in it with onus, this disaster can result.
Very well said. Thank you, sir. The next one is for Saurabh Bhai. Saurabh Bhai, see, it is very regular that, that these days, if you would see, especially post-2000, that lots of amendments are being introduced, like 50C, then 56(2), then 43CA, and 50D now, which is the latest addition in Income Tax Act. And you also mentioned about 292C. These are all fictions which have been introduced, whereunder the authorities are allowed to take a position, accept or assume a value to be the sale consideration or the purchase consideration. Now, in such case, the question which arises is that assuming for the time being that legislature is empowered to do so, constitutionally also, are these presumptions rebuttable? Because in some of the cases we see in the very same provisions, when it comes to adopting a value which is a historical value, I am permitted provided I produce certain proofs that payments were made by check. But when it comes to the full value of consideration, it says this is the value which you have to take, and that is not something, which is perhaps so negotiable. So please enlighten us.
To begin with, theoretically, if the law says shall presume, it is a presumption to be drawn which may not be rebuttable. But if the legislature uses the phrase may presume, it is a rebuttable presumption. But that's entirely on a theoretical basis. Let's look at the facts or the issues before me. Section 43CA and Section 50C create a fiction that if you transfer land or building at a price below the Jantri rate, then the consideration received by you shall be substituted by the Jantri rate and you will have to pay tax on the difference. The question is whether such a presumption can be made in law. Now, the system of presumptive tax has always been there under the tax laws. If you look at historically the dispute as to this, for example, in the case of A. Sannyasi Rao, 219 ITR 330 in relation to section 44 AC, Supreme Court said you can always have a presumptive taxation. But a presumptive taxation, Supreme Court says, will not substitute actual taxation of income if SSE claims my income is not what is presumed to be income under presumptive taxation. Even now, recently in the Supreme Court in the case of SEDCO Forex, 399 ITR page 1 upheld the system of presumptive taxation under section 44BB. Having said this, let's now go to the specifics. When we had a similar provision earlier under section 52(2), where the revenue had a right to substitute for consideration fair market value if fair market value was at variance with the consideration by more than 15%, the argument for the Supreme Court was if there is a variance of more than 15%, revenue has unvariably, unhesitatingly right of substituting the consideration. In the famous judgment of KP Varghese, Supreme Court says 131 ITR 597, these are all rebuttable presumptions, and therefore if SSE can actually show that he has not received anything more than the sale price, you have no right to substitute for consideration the so-called market value. But that principle runs counter to section 43CA and section 50C. And there is a feeling that section 50C and 43CA are sections of which consequences cannot be avoided under any circumstances. If there is a difference, you will have to necessarily pay tax. Is it the situation? Suppose I find that the circle rate is rupees 20,000 per meter, but then my property is encroached by the encroacher since ages. I don't have an inch of land available to me, or next to me there's a huge slum, as a result of which there is no possibility I can get the full price. Do I have to still pay tax at rupees 20,000? I can understand the argument of going to DVO and getting a lower price, but everybody knows DVO is in his own regime and will never give the realistic price. I find, without really getting into whether the courts have a power to go below section 50C rate, there's a judgment of Allahabad High Court in the case of Chandranarayan Chaudhary, 38 taxman.com 275. I'll be citing quite a few judgment of taxman.com, so I'll say TC, 38 TC 275, which has taken a view if an SST leads evidence to show that as a matter of fact, market value is not equivalent to the Jantri rate, he cannot be called upon to pay the difference. This is also the view of Kolkata Tribunal in ITA number 640 of 15, Bajaj Chemicals, Ahmedabad Tribunal in the case of Desai, Hema Desai, ITA 3240 of 2016, and a recent order of Ahmedabad Tribunal in ITA 21607 of 17, Lovi Ranka. In other words, courts and tribunals have taken a view that if an SSA can establish by leading evidence that the market rate, Jantri rate is far higher than what I have actually received, SSA may be able to get away by arguing that I will not be required to pay tax on the full. If a view is taken that no, he shall have to pay the tax, in my view, it may be possible to argue that the provision is ultra vires the Constitution of India, in as much as it is seeking to tax me on something which is not my income. The power to levy tax is on income, and if there is no income, you can't tax on a notional profit when I've actually not earned it. Similarly, section 56(2), if I receive something, if I receive gift of a share of a company of which breakup value or 11 UA value is rupees 100, but then it is found that there are huge hidden liabilities in the company which are likely to mature after 1 or 2 months, which will suppress the value of share from 100 to rupees 25, I have a right to say market value of share is rupees 25 and not rupees 100. So far as section 292B is concerned, it only raises a presumption as to validity of notice. Frankly, it is not really material from the point of view of presumption. We'll go to the notice a little later. Two sections, however, require some consideration. 292BB. Under 292BB, if an SSC participates in the proceedings or cooperates in the proceedings, he is rewarded by a negative factor. Negative factor being, if he participates in the assessment proceedings or if he cooperates in the assessment proceedings, he would then be prohibited from raising an argument that notice was not validly served, nor correctly served, notice not was appropriately served. And therefore, one can argue that if you believe that you are not correctly served, you would rather raise an objection to begin with or may not participate. However, one aspect over here, Supreme Court has very recently taken a view in the case of Lakshman Das to 417 ITR 326 that if an SSE can show he was not served at all, Section 292 BB presumption will not come in the way of SSE, and SSE would be entitled to claim that the proceedings are invalid. One section which is left out, which I must take because it also deals with the issue which my distinguished friend has stated, 292C. 292C raises the presumption that if at the time of search or survey, any books of account, documents, etc. are found, they belong to you and they contain entries which will bind you, and obviously therefore income will have to be offered for tax by you or you will have to give explanation. Question is whether Section 292C presumption is rebuttable or not a rebuttable presumption. Can an SSE argue that yes, I am found to be in possession of a piece of paper or a diary which might on a first blush show that I have unaccounted income, but factually A, paper does not belong to me, B, if it belongs to me, it's a rough working, C, even if it is not a rough working, it is not something which is realized by me. Can he give an explanation explaining that this is not a presumption which should result into reality? Bombay High Court recently has taken a view in the case of Umesh Irani, 108 TC 437, that SSE would be entitled to dispute the presumption under Section 292C, provided, and this is always provided, you lead necessary evidence to disprove the presumption against you. The same view is taken by Kolkata High Court in the case of Ajanta Footwear, 84 TC 109. But then I go to the issue which my learned friend Mr. Sridharan said. Can SSE say, I want to rely on 292C? Why would SSE say? Suppose at the time of the seized, at the time of search or seizure, a diary is found which not only has a record of undisclosed income, but also has a record of undisclosed expenditure. Can SSE say, okay, you go by the diary, tax income, then you must necessarily give me deduction for the expenditure also, because presumption is what is found at the time of search is necessarily correct. Can SSE compel the revenue to draw an inference in his favor on the basis of presumption under Section 292C? Kolkata Tribunal took a view, 32 TC 331, Vivek Kumar Kathalia, that SSE would be entitled to rely on 292C and make claim of deduction of expenditure on the basis of record found at the time of search. However, and a note of caution, Bombay High Court recently took a view that you cannot blindly rely on 292C, because even if something is found at the time of search, recorded in books of account or a diary, unless SSE is then able to substantiate what is stated therein, the SSE will not get the benefit of the presumption. The judgment of Bombay High Court is in the case of Harish Textile, 379 ITR 160. In other words, 292C presumption, though ordinarily is in favor of revenue, it's a rebuttable presumption, and therefore ordinarily revenue would like to rely on it. SSE will say, don't draw the conclusion or the inference. Sometimes SSE may like to draw inference on the basis of 292C, but similarly, revenue may say, you have not proved or you have not discharged your burden to show that this is an entry on which you will get the deduction. Therefore, to conclude, these are all provisions which draw by which you can draw an inference, but they are by and large rebuttable presumptions, provided you lead appropriate the evidence to rebut the assumptions against you.
Thank you so much. With your answer, see, we have a very wonderful hope that we can, in reserving cases, challenge the presumptive provisions, which are otherwise very harsh, like 50C or 43CA. And that is something which is very heartening.
Now that we are on that, see, till 2018, the Supreme Court had taken a view that a law can be challenged, validity of law can be challenged only on the two grounds. One, it is beyond the competence, legislative competence on account of the distribution of legislative power between center and the state under Article 286, read with 246. Or, if it is found it is violative of fundamental rights or constitutional rights. Supreme Court, in the case of Shaira Banu, said that a law can also be challenged if it is found to be manifestly arbitrary. In other words, if the law, so far it was believed that arbitrariness is the ground for challenging all executive action, no legislative action of superior legislation, laws. No law can be struck down on the ground that is arbitrary, because presumption is Parliament always acts rationally. The presumption is by and large wrong, but there is a presumption that Parliament always acts rationally. Supreme Court in Shaira Bano took a view that law can also be challenged on the ground of being manifestly arbitrary. This was followed later on in the case of Joseph Shine, then it was followed in the case of Puttuswamy. Recently it is followed in the case whereby the Amendment to Arbitration Act is struck down. The moral of the story is that if you find that a law is manifestly arbitrary, in as much as, for example, I am called upon to pay tax on income which is not there at all, and by no stretch of imagination it can be regarded as income, you may be entitled to challenge. My gut feeling is court will not strike down the law, court will read down the law and hold that essentially what is not income will not be taxed. Striking down the law is little difficult, but court always has the power to read down the law to deal with the situations of exception.
So considering this, this is for Mr. Sridharan.
I just wanted to add
Sure.
one line in that. Power to legislate on a particular topic includes power to enact provision to prevent evasion of tax. Power to tax includes enact provisions to prevent evasion of tax. So when we challenge these sections, we must also be able to demonstrate that this goes beyond the reasonable limits of provision to prevent evasion of tax. The fact that in a genuine case it may work in a harsh manner is no ground to strike down that section.
Ground to strike down.
So it's a difficult task.
Yes.
In a central act, particularly income tax, majority of the judges
Yes.
will uphold the section.
Yeah.
I told Justice Chandrachud once, sir,
Yes.
my score against the Advocate General ASG is 6 love, I said. 0 for me. Then he said, I told him, sir, my junior say, what is the use? You are a lawyer only for getting part payment and pre-deposit orders. When you challenge the validity, you always fail. Then Justice Chandrachud said, Sridharan, Central Act, you want the act to be struck down. Which court in a taxi statute will strike it down? He said, that's the reality.
That's why it was said that it could be read down, but not.
read down.
Yeah, could perhaps be. Yes, yeah. Hoping against the hope is, as we all have agreed that yes, that finally the whole aim of this today's session is to provide some kind of practical tips to our participants, so that is it possible to standardize this, see that in order to discharge my burden of proof, this is what Mr. Sridharan would tell me, that yes, this is the bare minimum you should do, and then you rest it at that level. So is it possible to standardize? That is one part of it. Permit me to go a little further. There are two other parts of it. Is it that in many cases, like say there had been a fire or an earthquake or a typhoon or cyclone, and it has so happened that I have not been able to preserve meticulous records which are required to be recorded, or that the witness has turned hostile. Now in such circumstances, is it possible for me to file an affidavit by stating the facts as I am conscious of, and that would be considered as a due discharge of burden or even a partial discharge of burden? And the last and very important thing is that in most of the cases one would see that yes, that I do succeed before the appellate authorities in establishing that there was a violation of justice, in as much as either the evidences which were placed were not appreciated, or the evidences which were required to be brought in by the revenue have not been brought in. Then the tribunal normally, and the courts also, would set this aside. Can I not in such circumstances say that, that what requires is that the order should be quashed and should be cancelled, for the reason that, that the authority which was required to respect the evidences has disrespected that. So these are the three things: standardization of the evidence, the validity of the affidavit, and the quashing of the order. I am aware that these three are different things, but then for the
no
brevity's sake, we have put
I
it.
do not have answers to any of this, therefore no problem.
Very well.
Sir, 2 points. It's something peculiar. In income tax, when they say set aside, we means restored back to the AO, remanded back. We in sales tax, excise, etc., we call it remand. When it is set aside, means we succeed without remand. So this is a peculiar nomenclature. The nomenclature which is used by tax practitioners now forms part of the act also. The word set aside is figuring in the act also. And otherwise, the word set aside never used to appear in the act the last
Sure.
10 years or so in
Sure.
the transfer pricing and when it's remanded back.
Yes.
So there is a nomenclature problem. Set aside for income tax lawyers means slightly different from this. Our CSTAT, High Court also, the impugned order is set aside and appeal is allowed. That doesn't mean the matter is restored back to the file of the AO. Okay.
Mean.
In income tax, no. In
Yes.
customs and excise, when the appeal is allowed
Yes.
and impugned order is set aside, the matter proceeding stands terminated and you succeed in the matter. That is one problem of jargon. So I just wanted to mention that.
Sure, sure.
Okay. The second, in this burden of proof, etc., we sales tax lawyers, I don't know anything about sales tax also, just as I don't know anything about the Supreme Court judgment of Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee in Chunnilal Prashadilal. It's a beautiful judgment, 62 STCS, something like that. The section says, if yarn used in the fabric is exempt from tax or low rate of tax, for this purpose, you may produce a form from the purchaser, declaration form, Form 3Ka or something they used to say in UP. Assessee said, that is one method of proof or not the only method of proof. It's a very powerful statement. Many times, we can point out that what the section requires is one method of proof, not the only method of proof. Alternate methods of proof are not forbidden. That's one interpretation possible. And that Chunilal Prasad recognizes that. But Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee, being a brilliant judge and brilliant taxist, went further. However, if the assessee proves in the manner specified in the section, it's irrebuttable. I repeat, if the assessee proves in the manner specified in the section, it is irrebuttable. The purchaser gives me a certificate that he has purchased it for use in the manufacture of fabric. Later on, it's proved by the tax department that the purchaser not so used it. The Supreme Court says you cannot touch the selling dealer. In other words, when the section provides method of proof, there's one method of proof, not the only method of proof. That's first, like most of us know. But if you prove by the method mentioned in the Act, it's irrebuttable as far as the selling dealer is concerned. And thirdly, if the Act prescribes a method of proof, and assessee follows that, the revenue cannot then say, please also produce proof that the purchase is registered, etc. I'm told these problems, similar problems arise when you contribute to a research institution or charitable institution, etc.
Same.
That purchaser has to give a certificate, and thereafter his certificate is cancelled, is not,
Yes.
etc., etc.
Yes.
Nothing can visit the selling dealer. That's one part of it.
Yes.
Before I deal with this affidavit evidence, this is all matter of common sense and the perception of a judge. As I remember one judge saying, I do not know of any law which requires me to accept an evidence which I believe is to be a pack of lies merely because unrebutted.
Ah,
Merely because the evidence is unrebutted, but the judge is unconvinced about it. Okay. He is not bound to accept it.
he's not bound to accept. Yes.
Therefore, if you file an affidavit which doesn't inspire confidence,
Okay.
or what we call self-serving affidavit, that will take you nowhere, absolutely nowhere. So the affidavit should be of factual details, should be complete, and should be a proper dependent, etc., etc.
Yes.
Okay. I will just mention 3 cases. I don't have the citation, but the name I can give, all excise cases.
Sure.
And it only shows individual judges' attitude in these matters.
Yes.
There is no law in this.
Yes.
In Novapan, assessee produced affidavit of dealers to say this product is known as plywood. The Supreme Court says these are self-serving affidavits of dealers and therefore will of no consequence.
Yes. Yeah.
This is in Justice Jeevan Reddy's judgment when dealt with the classification of commercial plywood.
Sure.
But when a similar matter came before Justice Bharucha in Hindustan Ferrado, assessee produced evidence of dealers saying that I've been in this business for so many years, that dandruff-free shampoo, whether it's shampoo or not. The assessee argued this is for a dandruff treatment, and therefore nobody will use it as a shampoo, and produce affidavit of technical experts of the ingredient of the product, and this. Court then said this affidavit evidence cannot be ignored as self-serving.
Right.
Okay. So, as a general rule, a bald affidavit saying there is an earthquake and therefore it's a convenient excuse for me to say all documents are lost will not be believed.
Well,
It has to be complete and self-contained.
right.
That's what my submission is.
That's it.
And about the last part,
Yes.
about assessment to be set aside, etc. This is the judgment of Chief Justice Bhagwati, the Supreme Court, Superintendent of Customs is Pratap Roy. Appellate authority says you have not been granted proper opportunity, and therefore appeal allowed. That's the only line. You have not been heard, opportunity is not granted, therefore appeal allowed. The assessing officer
This is
restarted the proceedings. The assessee argued there is no remand by the
Exactly.
appellate authority. He cannot restart the proceedings.
Right.
Chief Justice Bhagwati in the Supreme Court said, no. When an order is set aside on the ground of natural justice, in the example where demand notice is straight away raised by the officer, it is set aside, it is quashed, let us say, and there can't be remand because you'll remand it to the stage in which illegality occurred. Before the demand notice, nothing was there. On the other hand, if a valid notice has been issued to you to initiate the proceedings, during the course of the proceedings, it did not give proper opportunity, and therefore passes an order which is breach of natural justice. The illegality occurred during the course of the proceedings. So matter will be set aside at the stage and restored back to the file of the AO. So in my opinion, if the matter is validly initiated, whether you call it 143(2) notice or whatever it is, and irregularity or illegality occurred later in the form of natural justice, then matter should be restored back to the file of AO. That's the general rule. However, there are some exceptions and the matter of common sense. If, due to the passage of time, the assessee is now not in a position to produce rebuttal evidence, due to the long passage of time, court can say remand will be a burden on the assessee, it will prejudice him, therefore, in these special facts, remand will not be ordered. So, as a general rule, if it is a breach of natural justice, it will be remanded back. If the order of the appellate authority is silent, but you can read from the whole order as a whole, it's a clear case of natural justice, it will be already restored back to the AO, but in special circumstances, court can say, we cannot order remand at this distant point of time. Absent that line, in my view, proceedings can recommence.
Very nice, sir. The only difficulty which one faces here is that litigation today is very expensive. It is tiresome. And you know, this is like giving a fresh innings of life to a person who actually committed a wrong, you know, in spite of being told and cautioned that, look, sir, you are committing a wrong. And he simply ignores it. This
You
is
are
what-
saying
Yes.
in a case of flagrant violation of natural justice, in a marginal case we can understand. Flagrant case should the revenue be given a second innings. Okay. Theoretically,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, no problem.
In spite of asking for the cross-examination, it was not granted. In that, cross-examination was requested, but it was not granted. In those circumstances, Supreme Court took a view.
No, but Andaman Timber, 62taxman.com, page 3,
Yes.
Supreme Court did not set it aside for this reason. Cross-examination was not given, but then Supreme Court Justice Nariman says that if you ignore the statements which are not subjected to cross-examination, revenue has no other evidence on which it can rely to frame assessment against the SSC, and therefore there is no reason to send it back. In other words, that was the only evidence on which revenue relied, and once that evidence is taken out, if there is nothing available to the revenue, Supreme Court said we would not send
No,
the
but
matter.
what Gopal and Pradeep Bhai's question is, why can't you be now given an opportunity to cross-examine? That's a question of discretion.
Correct.
In a given case, they may say no. In
Yeah.
a given case, they may say yes.
Yes.
Due to long passage of time,
Yes.
you will not be able to get the witnesses, cross-examine, etc.
Sure.
But that line should be there. But if you
Yes.
tell a judge, at that line, they'll say no.
Yeah.
You can take it from in practice.
Wonderful. See, friends, we are having a very wonderful discussion. The only thing is that the time, as usual, is a villain here. See, we have crossed almost 60 minutes and we have covered just 1/5 of this. With this, in all my humility, without any insistence, on your behalf, I would request, the very learned, panelists to restrict the answers to about 3 minutes, if that is not an indulgence. Yes. I'm extremely sorry to do so.
No, no,
We all are here. This was one promise
So there
which
is one
I
other way
taken
of
from
solving
the
it.
organizers.
One other way of solving it. One of my friends gave a joke. A postman, post office in charge, was to come at 9 o'clock. He came at 11:30. Long queue was there. It was to close at 12. So he came at 11, promptly left at 12. He says, I don't want to repeat the mistake, same mistake twice. Karke. So
No. So there is actually, I'm holding a promise from the organizers that no matter what is the time, we would see through that we have, we utilize the rare opportunity to the best possible. So the next question is for Mr. Soparkar. This is something which we touched upon, that there is an amendment in section 68 which seeks to bypass an otherwise general understanding that I would have, by proving the source of the lender, discharge my burden by leading the evidences. Now, section 68 amendment provides, with effect from AY 1314, stating that, that not only I have to prove the source, but to also prove the source of source. The question, therefore, your consideration is that, can a burden be heightened or can it be made higher in such circumstances by an amendment? That is.
See, burden of proof is a matter of procedural law, as was rightly pointed out by my distinguished colleague. And therefore, you can always increase the burden, and you cannot really say that because burden is too heavy, we will not abide by that particular rule of the game. But there is one development which I must bring to your notice. I am conscious of the fact that Bombay High Court has taken a view that amendment to section 68 is prospective from assessment year 13-14. But would it be a good law anymore? The reason is, now the Supreme Court has taken a view in the case of NRA Iron and Steel Private Limited, 412 ITR 161, that it is in relation to assessment year 9-10. When the SSC had given names, addresses, confirmation, balance sheets, proof, permanent account number, in other words, had proved the name of the lender, the capacity of the lender, and the genuineness, he was still made addition in relation to share capital with premium. CIT appeal deleted it. Tribunal confirmed deletion. High Court dismissed tax appeal. In spite of these three concurrent view, Supreme Court reverses all the three by holding this is nothing but a bogus share capital. Why? Because SSC did not prove source of a source. Please mark in 9-10 that was not the obligation. Exactly. The Supreme Court says the SSC could not produce the investors, though they all came forward and gave explanations, some of them. Some of the investors were not physically available at the place where they were supposed to be. I'm not going greater into it for want of time, but please mark this judgment in distinction with the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Orissa Corporation 159 ITR 78, where Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee said that where SSC has given name, addresses, confirmation of the lenders, the mere fact that lenders did not appear before the authority, or lenders agreed that they are the name lenders, but then in the list of the parties to whom they had lent the name of the SSC was not figured in. Supreme Court says then SSC cannot be faulted once SSC is given the name of the SSC, name of the depositor, permanent account number, and the transaction is through banking channel. This judgment of Orissa Corporation is not even referred to by the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of NRA. The strength of the bench is the same. But the Supreme Court now notes we cannot be oblivious of the fact that there is huge scale black money racketeering going on, and a lot of black money is being converted into white by virtue of the cash credit, share capital, premium. Supreme Court also said SSC has raised money by way of share premium of rupees 190 per share, and SSC could not explain from the investors, or they mean in other words, investors did not come forward and explain why did they invest money at a premium of rupees 190, which would mean effectively all cases of share premium which is received by the SSCs would now be hit by this judgment. And therefore, I do not really subscribe to the view that law is being amended only by legislature. Even Supreme Court, by taking these kinds of views,
Correct.
maybe by being conscious of the fact that this kind of racket is going on of hundreds of crores or thousands of crores of rupees, has come down very heavily. But once Supreme Court lays down the principle, we are obviously bound by it.
We are bound by it. The next question is one which both of you, sir, would be requested to answer. And the first answer would be by Mr. Sridharan. That, sir, we come across, these days, as Saurabh said, is that there is a blatant tax evasion which is systematically, scientifically, practiced with the help of multiple chain of parties. And in such case, a person who is otherwise labeled as a kingpin, he makes a statement stating that all that what has happened in these 200 or 400 companies, they are companies which are run by me or by my cronies, and therefore whatever transactions have happened, whether of share premium or penny stock or lending or such other things, are unbelievable. They are just paper transactions. Now, based on this, to my understanding is in the city of Mumbai itself, there are about 6,000 cases which have either been reopened in the CST, GST cases or sales tax, or equal number of cases in the Income Tax Act. And the racket involves about 60,000 crores of rupees of taxes. Now, in such circumstances, what should be the correct position in law, which we request you first to answer, and then Mr. Soparkar should respond to that.
My close friend, Mr. C.B. Thakkar, is here. Okay. But I'll tell you what happened. You've given us 3 minutes, so I'll take 1.5 minutes. No problem. There was a section in MVAT Act that purchaser can take input tax credit only on proof that the supplier who has collected the tax from the purchaser has remitted to the state. So purchaser has paid to the state, purchaser has paid to the seller has not remitted to the state. And section said we will not give you the input tax credit. We challenge the section, saying that you have remedy against the seller if he has not remitted the tax, power to forfeit, etc. The indirect tax, I have paid it to him. Where is the question of me being denied the input tax credit? Section is unreasonable. Judge was initially with us. Then the state stood up and read out an affidavit saying such and such fellow who was in a slum got registered in sales tax, and within 1 month his turnover was 500 crores. Another fellow was a driver, his turnover was 1,000 crores. Read out the 2-3 affidavits. The court said nothing doing, we will dismiss the petition. The facts were so gross in terms of this so-called this thing. The genuine cases are now stuck. And the legal answer they give is, as far as input tax credit is concerned, it's purely a matter of legislative mercy and legislative sympathy to you. Nothing compels them in law to give input tax credit. They can deny you the credit in law and ask you to pay tax both on the raw materials and the finished goods. So the legislature therefore gives you the input tax credit. They can put any condition they want. If therefore they put the condition that the seller has not remitted tax to us, we will deny you the input tax credit, that section is perfectly valid. It is possible that you have paid it to him, but we are not concerned with that. That's the view the court has taken. And there also a presumption. Anybody who has benefited from a fraud is a party to the fraud. The presumption, you have to prove, I am a bona fide purchaser. The first presumption is yes. But if you have benefited from the fraud, the presumption in equity is you are a party to the fraud. You may disprove it otherwise. So in these circumstances, if that penny stock fellow says I have sold goods or provided service to these people and raise only paper invoice, there may be cases where to give lend a genuineness to the transaction, the penny stock fellow made a paid service tax and GST and remitted to the government also, because he wants to not give a handout to the tax department from that angle. Even then the department can say, yes, but you have not received the goods or not received the services, therefore I'll deny you the credit. That's the reality, and there's a serious challenge to that.
The procedural question is, what do I do when I find there are statements against me? The answer is, you will have to ask for cross-examination. If you don't ask for cross-examination, the statements will necessarily be read against you, and you will not be able to give any explanation explaining the statement unless you challenge him in the cross-examination. I'm told sometimes, but sir, ultimately what do I gain by cross-examination? Maybe you will gain nothing, but by not cross-examining, you are losing out on everything. The courts have taken a view, a statement which is not subjected to cross-examination may not be really be read in evidence. Apart from Andaman Timber, we have old judgment of Supreme Court in the case of Kishnich and Chelaram, 125 ITR 713. But that takes me to the next interesting question. Do I have to ask for a cross-examination, or is the assessing officer required to offer cross-examination to me? In other words, he only gives a statement to me, does not say, I offer you cross-examination, I do not ask for cross-examination. Can I raise an argument at a later date that I am not given opportunity of cross-examination, or by not asking for opportunity, I have forfeited my right? Courts have taken a view, you have to ask for cross-examination. If you do not ask for cross-examination, you will not get the benefit of the argument that a statement which is not subjected to cross-examination will not be read in evidence against you. We have judgment of Kerala High Court 101, Taxman 164, Suresh Kumar T. Jani, as also Madras High Court, Srinivasan 404 ITR 433. If cross-examination is asked for and is not granted, obviously we have a right to argue that statement should not be read against me. Whether the matter would be sent back or not is a different issue. Before Bombay High Court recently an argument was made, because the cross-examination was not offered, please do not read the statement. Bombay High Court said in Kunwarji Fibers 77 TC 345, but you asked for cross-examination too late, EO could not have granted. But it also said, even if cross-examination is, the statement is ignored, there is enough evidence otherwise to hold against you. So it is not as if you ask for cross-examination, you will solve the problem, you'll have to deal with everything. That's one aspect that you need to do. Secondly, what you can do is you can independently lead evidence to point out that what is allegation against you is not correct. Maybe get the affidavit of the very person now saying other way around. Maybe prove independently by leading evidence to show that what he is saying is not correct. What would be the statement would all depend upon the facts of each case. For example, if somebody says, I have not sold goods to you, and if you can then produce evidence on record to show goods have actually come, I have actually taken in my stock register, I have used, based on that, I have actually sold the goods further down, or I have manufactured the goods and sold the goods further down, maybe you will be entitled to argue, don't disallow the purchases at all, or if at all it is to be disallowed, you might disallow a part of it, the whole cannot be disallowed. This question comes up a little later also, I might go into a little greater detail at a future date, but answering this question, unless you proactively try to deal with the situation, you will not be able to avoid the consequences of adverse inferences against you.
In excise and customs, not only you have to ask for cross-examination, the courts have held, you must give a reasonable reason for cross-examination. So mere bald request for cross-examination also will not be acceptable. You have to have justification for it also.
So we need
So
to.
then the problem, how do you do justification?
Yes.
The very reason for cross-examination is to elicit the truth.
So that's a challenge by
It's
itself.
a big problem.
Income tax proceedings courts have been reasonably
But
fair.
customs and excise regularly they say,
There is.
bald requestment is not a stereotype request, no reasons given,
Yes.
and therefore,
Not tenable.
even if you ask, the officer refuses,
Yes.
on the ground you are not given justification for it.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. See, I have a friend here. We always has a different view, and he has been waiting for long. For 7 questions, he has not raised his finger. Now Gopal wants to cross what the seniors have said.
Sir, as you were saying, suppose cross-examination was not asked for in the initial stage. Department relies on the statements. Subsequently, in the appellate proceedings, at the first or second stage, the SSC brings the affidavits of the person whose statement was being relied. So whether the concept of hostile witness comes into play. Because then the entire proceeding will collapse.
No, question of hostile witness is hostile witness a person who is a witness of a party, and then when he's in the witness box, he starts answering against the interest of the very party who has invited him. Now, if revenue is relying upon the statements of the witnesses, they are, to begin with, hostile to me. They are not hostile witnesses. Because they are the witnesses of the revenue. They are not my witnesses. When I am asked, I am calling them for, not for examination, I am calling them for cross-examination. And in any case, rules of Evidence Act being not applicable, the rules as to what you can put in cross-examination versus what you can put in re-examination, what you can ask in examiner chief, those rules in any case would not apply. So that is not any kind of an issue.
One small point. There was a matter of just Rumapal's judgment. Sometimes, in cross-examination, we are unsure. You may strengthen the evidence against you. That's the risk.
Yes, yeah.
And therefore, you get affidavit.
Yes.
The Supreme Court in Rumapal in an excise matter frowned upon it and said there is no business, you have no business to contact the other side witness.
You have no
And
business.
this sort of evidence is unacceptable. Affidavit cannot be laid in of the parties. You have to only do cross-examination.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just,
yeah. No,
detailed judgment of Justice Rumapal, I can get the
This
citation.
is very interesting. So therefore, if I were to push a retraction statement or an affidavit,
Sir, you
that's
cannot-
something
Yes, you cannot contact the other
because
side
it's
witness.
revenue's witness.
Yes, you cannot do that.
Oh, yes.
You have to test it only by
Oh
cross-examination.
yes, yeah. This is something very interesting. Yes.
Supreme Court, just Rumapal judgment, 2003 or so.
Sure. Right, sir. So we did refer to 292C, and there is a similar provision which was the operating for 132(5) orders and 132(4)A precisely. Now, what happens is that many a times it's usual to come across, say, seizure of several documents, which otherwise are titled as dumb documents, known as dumb doc, because, they don't have the legs to stand. They are either not, in the handwriting of the person from whom it has been found, or they are not signed, or sometimes they don't even carry the dates. And sometimes, the numbers are not complete and absolute. So in such circumstances, what is the law relating to that?
What is a dumb document? Dumb document is a document which does not really convey any meaning, from which you cannot draw any conclusion, which does not permit you to draw a reasonable inference. I was trying to search if I can find some judgment which will explain what a dumb document is. I find a tribunal order of Jodhpur bench in the case of Satyapal Vasan, 295 ITR 80 section 352, where they have said a dumb document is a document which is A, not bearing any name, B, is in the nature, does not explain the nature of transaction, C, does not give an idea of the quantum involved. It may say 45, 30, 50, whether it's 45,000, 45 lakh, 45 crore. So it doesn't really clarify the quantum involved, or it does not give the period. It gives the figures, but for which period they may not really be immediately evident. Therefore, a dumb document would be a document which cannot be deciphered easily. But merely because some information may not be deciphered easily may not really lead us to conclude it's a dumb document. For example, document may bear some dates, some amount of check, some amount of cash. If check figures are reflected in the books of account, you can't say it is dumb vis-a-vis cash, but it is brilliant vis-a-vis check. Obviously, either the paper is right or the paper is wrong. So what would be a dumb document is essentially a matter of fact. But courts have taken a view that if you can establish document is a dumb document, no addition can be made on that basis. Lead judgment of Delhi High Court Girish Chaudhary, 296 ITR 619, where a piece of paper was found, different figures were written, 35, 47, 48, etc. Total was 48. On that basis, 48 lakh was sought to be added. High Court said this is dumb document. We don't know what this 48 pertains to. Similarly, in the case of Jaipal Agrawal, 28 TC 269, Delhi High Court, when it came to the question of Binami, said this is a dumb document. Finally, in the case of Education Trust, 42 TC 255, Allahabad High Court takes a view. In case of an education institution, a piece of paper was found which apparently indicated that fees are received in cash, and on that basis, additions were sought to be made in the hands of the university. Then it was pointed out, nothing is shown as to what is the amount received, from whom it is received, when it was received. High Court accepted it and deleted the addition. Therefore, it all depends upon the facts as to whether you can draw an inference, a reasonable inference. If you can draw a reasonable inference, it is not a dumb document. But if you have to just try on your imagination for the purpose of drawing some inference, it will be a dumb document.
Thank you so much.
Sir, there was an old case which Lakshmanan sir argued in 1985 or so.
Okay.
There's a assessee from Nagpur who is a furniture manufacturer, steel furniture.
Yes.
Some records were seized and documents showed OT.
Yes.
So department says it's an office table. The assessee explanation is, sir, it's overtime payment.
Yes.
Whether it's so when I was explaining this to lawyer friend, there is Sridharan in Jain Hawala diary case.
Yes.
The claim was, it is written as LK. LK means LK Advani.
Yes.
It could be Lakshmi Kumaran also. So when I was explaining his OT example, he
Yes.
said correct answer for this.
This could be you
So
also.
the document is, if
Yes.
it inspires confidence of a court as to its veracity and authenticity and inference to be drawn. That's really the only thing.
Otherwise, it would be a dumb document.
Yeah, that's-
Very well said.
V.C. Shukla judgment is now followed by Supreme Court in the case of Sahara Diary, common cause 394 ITR 220, where
Yes.
Supreme Court has also accepted merely on the basis of rough diaries, no additions can be made.
That should be the.
Now, interesting part was,
Yeah.
revenue was saying no addition be made on the basis of these diaries.
Oh,
And third party was saying, sir, additions must be made.
Must
Revenue
be
said,
made.
settlement commissioner is right in deleting the addition. And in the basis of Sahara diary, because names of those mighties were there,
Yes.
and revenue wanted to protect them. So
Correct.
revenue said, sir, these are useless diaries,
Yes.
don't make the addition on this basis.
Sir, Justice Goda Raghuram from Andhra Pradesh, he was telling us, in Satyam case, everybody says the bank balance, etc. is
Yes.
inflated.
Yes.
Income tax departments are audited balance sheet sacrosanct. We'll make an addition.
Yes.
So Attorney General came
Yes.
and he took the stand. The income tax department is right.
Yes.
Justice Goda Raghuram is an experienced judge.
Yes.
He told him, let the income tax department file an affidavit.
Yes. That this is.
And
right.
affidavit never came, and therefore this argument was not pursued.
Yeah, very well said. You know, there have been feelers, I believe, from the organizers stating that, 6:30 is the time wherein, we need to close for the reason that there is some another program. Having said that, therefore, I would to begin with take the honorable panelists to the important questions, and thereafter, time permitting, we'll turn back to that. So therefore, sir, we request your attention to question number 17. 17, which is for both of you. This is about that quite often the issue that arises for consideration is that in certain situations one would believe that it is the assessing officer who is under a burden to prove that what I am claiming is not allowable. In some cases, there is an issue that wherein the assessee is put to burden. So we have listed some of the instances in which who is the person who is required to discharge the burden. So therefore, the first few could be taken up by Mr. Sridharan and the rest of them could be taken up by.
Thank you very much. If there may be provisions like Travancore case,
Yes.
where the mensura is not there, etc.,
Yeah.
absolute proof, etc.
Yeah.
So,
with-
for underreporting and misreporting, now I would believe for underreporting, burden is on the SSC, because underreporting only means difference between returned income and assessed income is your income on which there will be penalty. If you do not want penalty to be imposed in spite of the difference, for underreporting, burden will lie on you. But for misreporting, where the allegation is you have not correctly disclosed the income, your entries are not shown, bogus expenditure is debited, burden would be on the SSC. Once revenue discharge is the initial burden.
So we all should consider ourselves to be fortunate, and when I say so, please believe me. This is a very important principle which has been opened up before you, which is a law which is applicable from AY 1718. It's a new law and would be understood differently under Income Tax Act, and it would have taken years, at least for people like me, to even understand what Saurabh has just explained. That there is a material difference in the penalty provisions, what Mr. Sridharan stated, and further to that, to further re-refine and restrict it to the underreported income and misreported income. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, yeah, please.
For sustaining book entries, all yours, sir.
No, no, book entry is prima facie, SSC will have to show books are valid, then revenue will have to disprove this.
Gross
Service-
negligence. Gross negligence.
Revenue.
179 is a very important.
It's for the revenue to
Okay,
point
for
out.
the directors. Okay. Yeah,
84 and 85 of GST.
yeah, the same.
Right. Service of notice.
Revenue.
It's revenue. Very well said.
For application of deeming provision,
Yes.
as
Right.
to whether the grounds on which deeming provisions are being invoked for the revenue, once the grounds are invoked and it's satisfied, burden will shift to the SSC. In all this, there is nothing like burden absolutely resting on one person. It will go on shifting from place to place depending upon as to whether or not the party on whom initial burden lies has discharged that initial burden. Sir, please go ahead.
That's
Absolutely.
important.
No,
Yes.
the principle that deeming fiction create an artificial liability should be strictly construed. That's on the scope of interpretation of the provision. As Saurabhai points out, that artificial income, 222E loan is a dividend, etc. This is an artificial provision that has to be strictly construed.
Yes.
But if the fiction is created, the facts relating to the fiction, initial burden on the revenue, because it's facet of imposition of tax.
Yes.
There is no question of fiction for claiming deduction. वो तो होगा नहीं है.
नहीं होगा.
It will only for levy, so it's facet of that.
Very well.
For
बहुत-
claim for ITC,
Yes.
burden the assessee only, but I gave the example of Andhra Pradesh, how they can misuse the provision to harass. That's the.
These are the circumstances which we have in mind that, if the provisions are abused to inflict a burden,
Yes.
and demand an unreasonable discharge, there is a problem.
So this is an example of this. ITC is the case where we can easily take up with the administration, tell them to please look at the income tax experience, what is allowed under 37, subject to this thing. Okay. Therefore, because they are not trained for that.
Yes.
They don't have the habit of seeing the books and working out. Because the excise officer used to see the truck and the goods and assess. He's never used to sitting in his chair and assessing. That's the problem.
So the next one is for you, Saurabhai.
Loose
is that-
papers found.
Yes.
Depends upon from where they are found. If they are found from the SSC's premises, burden would lie on him. But if they are found from the premises of a third party and revenue seeking to rely against the SSC, it's for the revenue to prove those papers.
Yes. And next is for you, Mr. Sridharan.
Receipt of service have to be proved.
Have to
But the difficulty for goods you can prove.
Presumption. There is a presumption.
Section also requires that.
Yes.
And for goods you can easily prove.
Yes.
But say you take a lawyer's consultation.
Yes.
So if you ask the fellow to prove that you really received advice from Sridharan, that's impossible to prove.
It's
Whether it is
impossible.
worth it is even more difficult to prove.
Well, we only know the worth. But so this is where the difficulty is, that there is a presumption running against you.
That's
that,
right.
Yes, that the services were rendered.
You will be eligible for credit only if you prove receipt of service.
All right. Then only, not
Only.
otherwise.
Yeah, mere
Not-
payment by you and that man remitting it is not enough.
Right, yes.
It's a big problem.
All right. And what would be your view in relation to a confession made?
Okay. Actually, I don't know about income tax. In customs and excise, these people are very well trained. You give a statement on 1st January, retract on 5th January, okay. The excise officer will call you on up 15 days later and quietly say, in continuous statement of 1st January, I say so.
Yes.
So this fellow will write this. When the matter comes to the court, they will say, sir, he
Yes.
gave a statement on 1st,
Yes.
retracted on 5th. When he recorded a statement on 15th January, that party wrote in continuation a statement of 1st January.
Yes,
That's
yes.
one. And there are, I'm not saying in the wrong sense, very tough officers in DRI, okay, who
Yes.
will make you withdraw your confession statement.
Yes. Yeah. It's,
So
it's
that
quite
happens,
of-
I don't know in
quite of-
income tax, but,
Not
and
in
therefore,
income tax.
if we don't give the confession at the nascent stage of investigation to avoid this problem, court say you retracted belatedly
Yes.
and you did not retract it before the investigating officer. You give the retraction to the commissioner, not the investigating officer. All problem. In practice, therefore, confessions, if we can substantiate that you are in their custody for 3 days, 4 days, etc., okay, those sort of things circumstances will prove, rather than a bald statement.
Right. So therefore, but my question for Saurabhai is that can a confession statement by itself be an evidence in possession of the authorities to make whatsoever additions they want?
Confession is the best statement. Unlike Customs Act Section 108, where it is necessarily binding, in income tax there is no presumption that it is necessarily binding, but then why would department be required to lead evidence when you yourself agree?
Admission is the best evidence.
So I don't
They
believe
say
that.
admission is the best evidence.
So confession would certainly hurt you. If you want to get out of it, it will be for you to lead appropriate evidence to show that it was either under coercion,
Yes.
error, without understanding or whatever.
Yes.
But unless you can get out of the confession statement made by you, you are bound by it.
There is a difficulty, right? There is a
Of course,
difficulty.
oral
Very-
evidence vis-a-vis documentary
very
evidence,
well said.
document only prevail. So therefore, in a given case, you can prove by document that testimony is incorrect, no difficulty. As they say, witnesses can lie, circumstances and documents do not lie.
Very
The
well
criminal
said.
lawyers say,
Yes.
witnesses can lie,
Can lie,
circumstances
these
and documents do not lie.
Documents
so if you
would
can
not
prove your
lie.
case from documents and
Yes.
circumstances, no problem.
No, but otherwise there is an issue. Now this, takes us to a little different dimension or a level, whereunder we would like you to please explain to us that, yes, we have been told that, that by filing the necessary confirmation, the bank statements, the income tax assessments, my primary burden is discharged. With that, the burden is now cast on the assessing officer, right, to disprove what I have said. Can an assessing officer simply state that, look here, you have furnished, you have discharged primary burden, and I have discharged my secondary burden by simply relying on the confession? What other thing which I would be in a position to produce?
See, is it SS's confession or third party?
It is third-party confession.
Third party concession is a piece of evidence.
Yes.
That is one piece of evidence against me.
Yes.
I have then laid evidence in my favor, whatever may be the evidence.
All right.
Then it's a matter of evidence being laid by both parties.
Yes.
Which evidence is more believable
Yes.
on the theory of preponderance of probability, ultimately decision will be taken. Merely because somebody makes a statement against me, there is no reason to assume that what he is saying is gospel truth.
Yes.
He may be lying for his own reasons.
Yes.
He may have sold goods to me, but because he did not want to pay VAT, because he did not want to pay excise duty, he might have done transaction out of his books. How am I concerned? So merely because there is a third party statement in the pocket of the revenue officer, I am not really worried if I have laid independent evidences to show that that particular evidence is not reliable.
Very well. So carrying it further is that the trouble which I face is, can I simply in such circumstances say, as an attorney of the revenue, that, my secondary burden has been discharged. I was not required to do anything more.
Then it's all a matter of
Yes.
who has laid more credible evidence. See, then the courts will weigh
Yes.
your evidences versus revenue's evidence. If revenue says we have got a confessional statement,
Yes.
but if SSCS A asks for cross-examination, given, not given, given and SSCS at least got some kind of answer which is in his favor,
Yes.
SSCS produced, in case of supply of goods, necessary documents to show that goods have actually come.
Right,
In
right.
case of receipt of money, that money has gone back to his bank account, and from his bank account, money has not been withdrawn in cash. If these evidences are laid, courts will not go only on the basis of a person making a statement against you. He might make statement against you for variety of reasons. You are not
Yes.
bound by it.
So the ultimate evidences would be relevant.
Yes.
Would be. Thank you
You
so
need
much.
not show that fellow has hostility to you. That's one way of proving, but
Yes.
absence of hostility doesn't make his evidence admissible straight away.
That's it.
That's
So in some of the cases in GST or the indirect tax laws, whether I was in a business or not becomes very material. So for proving that I was in a business, or for revenue to prove that I was not in a business,
I was not able to follow that, sir. What the existence of business in the sense?
like, if one would see that for GST, for the purposes of GST, especially in the cases of real estate, now one would come across several cases wherein the landlord is not in the business and is therefore not a registered person under the GST. Now, in such cases, is there a presumption that yes, that the landlord has provided the service under the development agreement, supplied the services, even though he is not a registered person?
I'm still not clear.
I'm sorry.
No, my apologies, sir.
So no, not at all. So there is a famous circular, under which, disregarding the decisions of the courts, the government seems to have taken a view that execution of a development right results into provision of two-way services, supply of two-way services. Now, one view of that matter is, if a landlord is in a position to establish that he is not a registered person, he is not in a business, Now, in such circumstances, can there be a presumption against that? This is a
Okay.
limited question.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, once upon a time, 40, 50 years ago,
Yes.
the definition of dealer in sales tax law used to be
Yes.
who in the course of his business
Yes.
does this, etc.
Exactly. Yes.
Similarly, when capital gains was not a tax,
Yes.
then you say, not a dealer in shares, I'm an investor in shares.
Yes.
Similar in house properties.
Same way.
Okay.
Same. This is the issue.
The definition of business
Yes.
now in GST has copied from various sales tax laws, and it's become so wide, right? One-off transactions, adventure in the nature of trade, whether with regularity, profit motive, all of them are rendered irrelevant. Okay. So, the section says any supply in the course of business alone is taxable. But the definition of business is so widely couched that one-off transaction of giving a development agreement would be treated as in the course of business.
Could be
This
treated.
question would have been relevant
Yes.
pre-1967 in sales tax.
Hold on.
Today, no relevant.
It's not relevant. Oh.
Because section 7 says supply in the course of business.
Yes.
But if you look at the definition of business, everything will be business. Whether it's capital in nature, revenue in nature, one-off in nature, adventure in nature of trade, everything will be covered. So therefore, the contention that I have made a supply, but the supply not in the course of business, and therefore not a taxable supply, will be practically not applicable.
Yeah, well, this is a great carry home. You know, see, we all have been banking on an understanding that the person is not in a business and therefore he was not required to
Regularity,
be a registered-
volume,
Exactly.
frequency, all are
Continuity.
irrelevant because of statutory definition.
That VCFR factor would not
No,
be
no,
relevant.
absolutely not.
Thank you so much. So with that, the next question
Correct,
is
no,
for-
CV sir? Correct, no?
Yes. So the next question is for you, Mr. Sridharan. Question number 18. And here it is, we just need to briefly request you, to provide brief answers, that what are the proofs that would be required in these following cases? First is Hawala purchases.
First to prove it is not Hawala.
Okay.
No, but I want to tell you 1 minute only.
Yes.
There's a lot of problem in steel industry in this thing, saying that you have sold the goods, you have not received the goods, therefore credit is not available, etc.
Yes.
We were, many years ago, I was not very good in accounts, I just managed to get through that, scrape through it. But we are read this accommodation sales,
Yes.
not accommodation entry, accommodation sales.
Sales, yes.
We start in accounts, accommodation sales. The sales tax laws of 1940s, when Britishers were there, specifically said, in calculating a sales turnover, accommodation sales will be deducted.
Will be deducted. Ah.
And accommodation was defined as a transaction which parties agree is purely financial transaction. There's a legal sale, but there will be a legal repurchase.
Okay.
So that's purely for financing purposes, parties have recorded it. In other words, sales tax law recognized that as a genuine business deal.
Yes.
Okay? An act defined it. British legislations, British time legislations. Now, people think accommodation sale is something fictitious
Fictitious.
or non-bona fide. It is, if we have the stock, you can genuinely sell without physically delivering it and repurchase it. The so-called circular trading is perfectly valid so long as goods exist once at least. So, non-existent goods, only invoices printed in a stationery office, no question. Goods exist, but same goods is sold 10 times. According to me, there's absolutely no problem in GST.
Oh,
Okay.
that's it.
And the best answer is any standard textbook of Shukla Agrawal on accommodation sales, old definition of sales tax law on accommodation sales in 1940s, and there's nothing sinister about this. That's what our answer would be.
Okay, it's like sale and lease back.
Absolutely,
Sale and
absolutely.
lease back. Very
Absolutely.
well, sir. So the next is input tax credit. What is the least proofs required? What are the least proofs?
Firstly, you must, it's very difficult
Yes.
for supplier's fault, for dealing with people who are suspect, you may suffer.
Yeah.
And there are clients of mine who insist that they will not reimburse the GST to the supplier unless he has uploaded the invoice.
That's it.
Okay. But I am told there were greater people, smarter than us,
Yes.
who upload the invoice and delete it thereafter.
Yes, yeah. You can never beat a person
Absolutely,
with a
very
dubious
difficult.
mind.
Very
Yes,
difficult.
yeah, very
And
well.
there's a problem world over. Huh?
Yes.
Even in UK, this problem is there, what they call optigen cases.
Yes.
this
There is always
same
an
problem.
issue. Right.
Only difference is we call it hawala, they call it hijacked VAT number.
Okay.
Hijacked VAT number, or kuch nahi, nomenclature is different.
but-
That I'll use VAT number of
Yes.
Surparkar sir
Yes,
and
yes.
raise an invoice, so the tax office will go to him.
So
Sale is by me.
yeah.
So otherwise, absolutely the same.
Our vocabulary is enriched, you know. Thank you for that. Merchant taxpayers.
That's the circular trading.
Yes.
That's the merchant.
So-
Perfectly legitimate,
Perfect.
provided stock is there with one person at least.
The existence of stock
Absolutely,
is material.
that's the only reason.
Delivery thereof is not material.
Yes.
Right? So the next is detention of goods while in transit.
Unfortunately,
Yes.
we thought with GST coming, all the check post problems will be solved.
Yes.
Okay. We lawyers in Maharashtra do not know anything about check post because we don't have check post.
We don't.
But there are millions of our fraternity who are very lucky to have check post in UP, Kerala, etc. Every day I go to Kerala High Court, hundreds of EVA bills cases are there, hundreds.
Is it?
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Judge asked me in one case.
Yes.
I told him, sir, they are only putting tax and penalty. Yes. In Gujarat, they told them they put tax, penalty, and fine.
Fine,
Fine
yes.
can be equal to value of the goods.
Is
He
it?
then told them, please don't educate them. So it's a racket.
It's a racket.
And
yes.
Supreme Court unfortunately said, even a minor deficiency in the EVA bill, consignment is liable for prosecution.
Prosecution.
So truck number is wrongly written. They said deliberately written.
Is it?
We will never believe it to be a clerical error.
Yeah.
So the EVA bill is a new menace under GST. Okay. And I request whosoever is not practicing either income tax or GST,
Yes.
don't try to learn anything about income tax or GST. Just master the EVA bill. You'll have a successful career.
Okay. Thank you so much for a great tip, you know. Thank you so much. Yes, yeah. With that, you know, see, the last one for you, sir, is proof of payment of tax by a supplier.
Because GST Act now makes it mandatory that
Yes.
you will not get the credit unless the supplier has paid the tax.
It's must.
It's a must.
must.
And as I said, Supreme Court has said in the Reliance case from Gujarat
Yes.
that input tax credit is a legislative mercy
Yes.
and they can put any condition they want.
Yes.
So there's no escape from
There
that.
is no
please.
escaping.
You can't challenge the section successfully. There's a Delhi High Court who just struck it down, but I don't
Yes.
believe in those judgments.
Thank you so much. Now, question number 19 is for Saurabh Bhai. We'll quickly rush through that. What would you believe is the minimum essential requirement to get out of the penny stock cases?
If you can show you have held the shares for a significantly long period, you have held it
Yes.
through demat account,
Yes.
and you acquired them at a time when probably you had justification to do it,
Yes.
probably you will be able to sail through. Otherwise, you will be caught.
That's a good, very good answer. So the cases of bogus purchases as far as Income Tax Act is
If you can
concerned.
show quantitative material has come,
Yes.
you should have no difficulty.
One should
At best, you will suffer GP addition or pro rata some disallowance.
That's-
Otherwise, if you cannot show quantitative
There is a-
consumption, you
Yes.
have a problem. You have
Yes.
judgment of Bombay High Court on both sides where
Yes.
quantitative addition was not there.
Yes.
Shoreline Hotel 98 TC 234.
Shoreline. Yes.
But where there are quantitative details available,
Yes.
Gujarat High Court, Simit P. Shade 356 ITR 451, or again Bombay High Court 372 ITR 619. So you must be able to show that actually you have received the goods. Whether the party sold it or somebody else sold it may not really then matter much.
So keeping the quantitative records will help you a lot.
Yes.
Issue of shares at a high premium.
Now that Supreme Court has in NRA said you
Yes.
must justify the high premium,
Yes.
you must also justify the capacity of the investors.
Yes.
If you can justify the capacity of investors,
Yes.
and if you can justify the premium that is charged by you,
ah.
in spite of this judgment of Supreme Court, you may
Yes.
still not really have a serious problem.
Yes.
We have a direct judgment of Bombay High Court dealing with this, accepting premium of rupees 10,900 on a share of rupees 10. In the case of Aditya Birla Telecom, 105 TC 206, where addition of rupees 2,069 crore was made by the revenue. High Court deleted it by saying there is enough evidence to show that premium is rightly collected. Person had a capacity to pay, and therefore the addition is deleted.
So therefore the justification of a premium perhaps would be the
capacity.
clinching factor and the capacity of the investor. Right. Thank you, sir. So the next one is receipt of loans from entry operators.
The question itself is self-contradictory, loan from an entry operator. But therefore, you will have to show it's the genuine transaction merely because he might have otherwise indulged into entry transaction.
Correct,
Does
yes.
not mean that
Does not
transaction vis-a-vis me is not genuine. If you can show repayment, the fact that money has gone to his account, from that money has not traveled to third party, otherwise he was able to advance money. That's the only way you can salvage the situation.
Yes.
But it's a case of salvaging operation.
No, I appreciate. Thank you. So the next is diary which records on money.
Probably you have no answer if the diary is very clear and explicit, like an accountant's diary, where he records check transaction, cash transaction, date-wise, party-wise,
Yes.
except for going to the settlement commission and arguing that against our own money, we also had own money expenditure and give us some GP benefit, you will not be in a position to get out of it.
We would not be in a position. Now, this is a serious thing. So we routinely come across issues under Section 9, which is a deeming fiction. Where in such circumstances, what is the minimum proof which one would be required to produce to prove that the income should not be deemed to have accrued in India?
See, revenue would have to lead evidence, at least to begin with, to show that the deeming conditions are satisfied. If the revenue leads those deeming conditions,
Yes.
satisfaction of deeming conditions,
Yes.
you'll have to disprove this. It will entirely be a matter of fact. If you
yes.
can point out that either the facts are not correct,
Correct.
or inference from the facts is not correct, you should sail through.
But the fact that, that the initial burden would be on revenue.
To at least allege.
To allege.
Correct.
That is very
Correct.
good. Very, very satisfying. And so the last is 68 to 69D.
As I said,
cases.
it's a matter of shifting proof.
It would be.
Correct.
But it would always shift.
To begin with, it will be on the SSC because it is money received by SSC Section 68 or
Yes.
money invested by the SSC 69,
Yes.
inadequately invested by 69A.
Yes.
It's to begin with, it will be on the SSC. Once SSC gives a reasonable explanation,
Yes.
because Supreme Court has said explanation doesn't mean any fanciful explanation. It
Yes.
has to be reasonable explanation.
Yes,
Once SSC gives reasonable explanation,
Right.
then the burden would shift on the revenue.
Right, sir. So with that, I would request you to come to 25. That's for Saurabh Bhai. For prosecuting a person, the tax laws presume the person to be having a culpable mental state. Please highlight the cases where such a presumption is rebuttable.
See, the section 278E reads that court shall presume existence of culpable mental state. Therefore, mens rea is assumed in relation to every offense under the Income Tax Act. So, burden is now on the SSC because the second part of the section says, but it shall be lawful for the SSC to prove that he had no such mental state with respect to act, charge, which makes an offense. In other words, it's for the SSC to disprove or discharge the burden cast on him. This provision was subject matter of dispute before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court in the case of Sasi Enterprise, Shashikala, famous, the Jayalalitha fame.
Yes.
361 ITR 163 Supreme Court said by virtue of section 278E, law now presumes, this was a case of failure to file return of income in time. Supreme Court says law will now presume you are guilty. You have committed an offense by not filing return of income in time. If you claim there were extenuating circumstances, there were reasons as to why return could not be filed by you in time, you lead evidence, failing which if you don't lead evidence, for want of evidence, you must lose, meaning thereby you must go behind the bar. Therefore, answering the question, in every case, the presumption is rebuttable, but there is a presumption against the SSC. Therefore, if SSC does not rebut the presumption, the only consequence would be he would be held guilty so as to suffer the consequences of penalty, so as to consequences of going behind the bar and or fine.
Thank you so much. So the last question, that is 27 for Mr. Sridharan, is an interesting issue where under that when you have claimed depreciation in respect of the GST element of actual cost of the fixed asset, then in such case I understand that under the GST laws the ITC would be denied. Now under Income Tax Act there are provisions where under you do not claim depreciation but it is presumed to be have been allowed, wherein your income is presumed to be an X percentage of a turnover. Now in such circumstances apparently the assessee has not claimed any depreciation.
I thought GST section says claimed and allowed.
Claimed and allowed.
No, claimed and allowed.
So is it therefore?
This is a classic example of
Yes.
the GST department not to refer to an income tax section because they do not know what it is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So according to me,
Yes.
the presumptive taxation or whatever it is
Yes.
might have factored in a depreciation in that
Yes.
whatever. We don't know the basis also.
We don't know the
But
basis.
for the section bar to apply,
Yes.
there should be a claim to the extent of the GST paid on it.
Yes.
Okay. You can claim depreciation on the basic, this GST portion should not be claimed as credit.
Yes.
Okay, depreciation.
Yes.
So it's a difficult point. The legislation is not cohesive, but you should be able to argue that in case of this presumptive, what you call presumptive taxation, no?
Yes.
We call it presumptive taxation.
Yes, we call it presumptive
Okay.
taxation.
This is not a case where GST section says
Yes.
claimed and allowed an income tax.
Yes, yes, yes.
What
Well-
has been enacted to overcome Mahindra Mills, etc., will not be relevant for this purpose.
Very well. Thank you so much. Well, friends, see, anything which is good and which begins has to end somewhere. I'm very much conscious that, yes, that, we were set about to get answers for 27 questions. Trust me, I've been carefully going through all the questions, and many of the questions which apparently have not been answered are actually answered in the vast explanation which has been provided by both the very learned speakers. At the same time, I would also request them, if possible, if at all possible, without putting them to any further burden of proving their knowledge, which is yeoman, is that if it is possible, I would request them to furnish the answers, because I could say that the notes which you have, is fantastic. And if we can in some manner be beneficiary of those notes, like Saurabh here, Mr. Sridharan's assistant, or Saurabh bhai, I can be your assistant, and therefore if we can do so, maybe let it take 3 months, 4 months, but if it happens someday, it would be good for the federation and good for all of us. Having said that, my sincere apologies for not having ensured and completed the whole discussion within otherwise the time allotted. One of the handicap with which we were suffering was we were to start this session at 4 o'clock, but we actually started this somewhere around 4:45. So you may please bear with me. With this, I will return the proceedings to Suhas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, what an amazing and enriching performance. Soparkar sir, Sridharan sir, and Pradeep bhai. Thank you for this excellent panel discussion. And end of every Jugalbandi is like we want to have more and more, dil mange more. That is what end of every Jugalbandi is, and therefore this also is the same phenomena. But we are all bound by our timelines, and therefore we have to end somewhere. However, Pradeep bhai very delicately has said that he is going to provide something like a video cassette or a CD cassette for us. Maybe he said after 2 months or 3 months, but therefore that Jugalbandi cassette will remain with us afterward. That is what he has tried to do it for us. With these closing remarks, may I give proceedings to Mr. Parab for taking it forward.
Respected panelist, V. Sridharan ji, Soparkar ji, moderator C. Pradeep bhai Kapasi ji, K. Gopal, Parans bhai, incoming President Nikita Badeka, other organization president and chairmen, past president, seniors, ladies and gentlemen. Friends, we have heard a very interesting discussion on shifting of burden of proof on direct tax and indirect tax. What Paranspai said that it is Jugalbandi, definitely it is Jugalbandi, it is addition to our knowledge. Friend, Sridharan sir said, burden of proof is a procedure part. Sir, I agree, even though I agree with this, that nothing is permanent in the universe. Like you said, burden of proof is not also permanent. Even I agree with Pradeep bhai also. He said, permanent is only wisdom. Sir, definitely what you said is absolutely right. Now coming to the Sridharan sir, it is in typical style of expressions that he gives lot of examples, quotes and jokes also. With this, he makes a session is very interesting and definitely knowledgeable sessions for us. With this, I would like to thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable times and knowledge. I request Shri Gopal sir, past president of Chamber of Tax Consultants, to offer a memento as a mark of love and affection to Shri V. Sridharanji. Please carry a loud applause for the speaker. Now coming to our another panelist, Soparkar ji, what to say about him? His knowledge is very crystal clear. The flow the knowledge of flow is very so smooth that with the sections, citations, case laws, the way he is presenting, we like to listen again and again. You know, the hunger of knowledge never end when I see him and when he's talking. Thank you, sir, for your sparing valuable time for us. I'll request Paranspe to offer a memento to the sir as a mark of love and affections. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now coming to our today's moderator, extraordinary, versatile personality, say Pradeep Kapasi ji. Whatever task we give, whatever subject he is handled, he is so accurate and perfect. What to say? Today also he has discussed lot of questions, queries generated by the delegates in a given specified time. He has covered up most of the questions. So definitely it is addition to our knowledge. What panelists suggested, expressed their views. It is a contribution to our knowledge. Thank you, Pradeep Bhai, for your sparing valuable times. I'll request Mr. Narendra Sonawade from GSTPM. He is there? No? I'll request to Avinash Lalwani ji, past president of Chamber, to offer a memento to Pradeep Bhai. Please carry loud applause for him. Last but not least, thank you all of you for sharing your love and support for these organizations. Thank you very much.